Hey everybody, and welcome back to Ready Steady Play. And I'm so excited to finally have the retail version of Root. If you remember back in December 2017, we played the print and play version of this game. We got some of the rules slightly wrong, so not in the rules and setup video for that, which was perfect, but for the print and play. The game has been updated. It's amazing how much has actually stayed the same, but it's amazing how much new stuff they've added as well. So I'm really excited to take you through these two boxes and teach you the rules for Root so that you can start your own battles of might and right in the woodlands at home. So stick around and I'll walk you through just what's in these boxes. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Root, Root is a war game with a slightly cartoonish art style set in the woodlands of different warring animal factions. I guess it's a bit like Redwall meets Risk, but with a dash of the coin series thrown in for the hobby gamers. And for those of you who aren't hobby gamers, each faction is asymmetrical and brings a slight twist to the gameplay and the conflict that you'll be enacting. The core set is for 2 to 4 players, and it's as ages 10 and up, and it takes 60 to 90 minutes, which again is going to be dependent on how familiar you all are with the game. I reckon this is quite a high teaching curve, but it's actually not that difficult to learn. For what it offers, it's actually very simple to grasp the concepts in your mind. There are 4 factions in the core set. That you can be the Marquise De Cat, the leader of the Cat faction, attempting to industrialize the woods and create an industrial juggernaut machine of war. You can be the Eyrie, who are the bird folk, the Eyrie Dynasties. They've been overthrown by the Marquise De Cat and are out for vengeance, but they're quite set in their old ways and are prone to getting so bogged down in the bureaucracy of their infighting factions that they tend to go into turmoil. Then you've got the Woodland Alliance. The Woodland Alliance are the downtrodden citizens of the forest, the foxes, the mice, and the rabbits, who live there and want to rise up and find power for themselves. The final faction is the Vagabond, a rogue agent who wanders the woods, doing deeds for the other factions, earning favor, or sometimes generating infamy and hostility as they try to leverage the conflicts for their own ends, whether those be benevolent or nefarious. When you sit down to play, each player will be given a faction. You'll have to decide how that happens for yourself. And then you can determine a starting player at random, and seating order should be randomized as well, because turn order is quite important, but random. Then you'll set up in a specific order and you'll be ready to go. The Riverfolk expansion increases the player count to 6 and adds 2 new factions, as well as an automata faction or an AI faction. The 2 new factions are the Lizard Cult, lizard folk spreading the word of their god around the woods, and the Riverfolk, who are traders looking to profit from the conflicts around them, warmongers essentially. You've also got a automated version of the Marquise De Cat, which you can play against in a solo mode, you can play against cooperatively, or you can add as an enemy into your competitive games to mix things up. Especially if you've only got 2 players, this will allow you to simulate a 3-player game. The Riverfolk expansion also comes with a second Vagabond, so if you feel so inclined, you can play the game with 2 Vagabonds instead of 1. So in this video, I'm going to have to do things a little differently to the way I normally do. I'll give you a brief look at the components that are in the box, and then we'll have a look at the generic setup for the game, which is going to be very short because there's not a lot of generic setup, and then we'll get into the gameplay. And the gameplay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover all of the generic rules that apply to every one of the factions. Root is very good in the sense that it's completely asymmetrical, but it ties everything together with some unifying principles that are very important to understand, because then you can look at how all of the different factions deal with those rules, and more importantly, how they all sort of break them in unique and interesting ways. So once I've talked you through the generic rules of Root, then we can look at each of the factions in more depth, and what we'll do is we'll look at the setup for those factions, and then how they play. What I'll do as well is I'll do what I normally do, which is put down in the description below the sections where you can find the timecodes for the different rules in case you want to look up something specific or reference something that I mentioned later on, so you can find it right around this video. So stick around and let's find out what's in this box. So in the box you should find a game board. The game board will have a woodland side for autumn or summer. I think it's autumn. And you'll also notice that on the other side of the game board there's a winter side. We'll talk about that later. There's also 3 rule books, which is great because it really gets you started quickly and easily. Now with this video you shouldn't need any of these, but if you ever have any questions, this is the place to look. This also covers the Riverfolk expansion, so the Law of Root has everything in it. However, if you prefer to be walked through the game with some pictures and diagrams and stuff, there's this Learning to Play book, which has got all these pictures and it's got a little pieces glossary on the back, and it's just a really great walkthrough on how to play the game. You've also got this sheet here, which is a 2-turn walkthrough on how to get started. So you can actually, this will help you set up the game and get started on 2 turns, and then by turn 3 you're playing the game and you should be ready to continue by yourself. However, we can put those to one side because if you're watching this video, by the end of the video, you should have everything you need in order to play. Now, you'll also find 4-player faction boards in this box, which look like this. Here we have the board for the Marquise De Cat. Now, I'll walk you through what all of this means when we get to the setup for the game and the gameplay section as well. However, what's important to note, and this is really helpful, is that on the back of these boards, you've got all of the setup rules for your faction. You've got here some flavor text, but also some hints and tips on how to do well with the faction. So reading this is actually incredibly helpful. And then here you've got this really useful guide to the complexity, the aggression, the card wealth, and crafting ability of the faction. Now, the complexity for me tends to mean how difficult it is to grasp the actual rules of the faction itself. So the Marquise De Cat is low complexity, for example, but that doesn't mean it's going to be simple to play. What I mean by this is that you'll be able to grasp the rules with ease, but there's still going to be deep strategy that you're going to have to think about later if you want to do well at the game. Aggression is moderate here, so you can win with being very aggressive, but also focusing on your economy and building up your own faction stuff. And then you've got card wealth and crafting ability. Card wealth is the card play in the game, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. And crafting ability is another way to score points as well. All of the factions have some way to craft, which allows them to score points and generate asymmetrical player abilities. But we'll talk more about that later as well. Up here you've got a handy guide to your pieces. Pieces in this game cover your warriors, your buildings, your tokens, which could represent anything from different kinds of buildings to wood. And also other pieces are listed here if you have any specialist pieces in your faction. Now, what's useful to note is that buildings are squares and tokens are circles. Some tokens here, like the keep on the Marquise De Cat, may certainly seem like they should be belonging in the building side, but they are not technically buildings. And this is an important distinction that we'll learn later. And these are all the pieces you'll need to gather to play the Marquise De Cat. We have another player board here for the Eyrie Dynasty, and you've got the exact same deal on the back here with your flavor text, your setup rules. Note that this is setup B, that's important for later. We've also got a guide here to how the faction plays, and their pieces at the top. We've got a player board for the Woodland Alliance and the Vagabond as well. Now we'll be taking a much deeper look at these player boards later and how they work. We've also got 2 D12 dice. Now one of the things you'll notice about these D12s is that instead of being numbered 1 to 12, they're numbered 0 to 3, and those numbers are just repeated on all the faces of the die, and they should be evenly distributed. We've also got this generic card deck here. These cards are going to be used by all the factions in the game, and everyone will be drawing from it and using the cards for different purposes, depending on which faction you are. But everyone will need to draw cards from this deck. And then what I've done is I've actually gone through the game already and organized these player bags, and the player bags contain all the pieces featured on the back of the player board so that the players can get started right away. So if you take a look here, you can see here that you've got all of this is the Eyrie Dynasties bag. You've got all of their warriors, you've got their roosts here, these are their buildings. You can tell they're buildings because they're square. And then they've got a deck of cards here, which are the cards used by the Eyrie. I've also included their walkthrough card and overview cards of the other factions that come in the box. I've got one here for the Woodland Alliance as well. Again, a little bag of all their tokens, their warriors, and the necessary cards they need to play the game. These 4 ruin tokens are going to be used in every single game you play, regardless of which factions you're using, so they're useful to keep handy and close separate. Here's the Marquise De Cat player bag. Again, we've got all the buildings, we've got the tokens, we've got the warriors, and we've got any cards relevant to their faction as well. These are suits for clearings. These are only used with the winter board, so we'll get these out later when we look at the winter board and how that works. I've got here the Vagabond bag as well. Now, the Vagabond has its own deck of cards, lots of cards there, and it's got lots and lots of tokens and things going on, but we'll use these tokens during setup, and I'll explain what they all mean as we go through the gameplay for the Vagabond. These are the pieces that are listed on the Vagabond's cards. What's worth noting is that you've got these faction tokens, one for each faction. You may have spotted that I've got the Riverfolk factions in here as well. But what's also important to note is that you've got these items here. Some have R on and some have S on. The items marked with S and R are unique to the Vagabond and will only be used when you play with the Vagabond, but there is another set of items here which you are instructed to set up every time you play because you'll need them with every faction when any faction crafts. But more on how that works in the generic rules section of this video. However, it's worth putting them in a separate bag because you'll need them to set up with every game. Now, it should be noted that everything in Root is component limited. So if you're ever instructed to do something with your components, what this means is that you'll do as many as you possibly can. So if you're adding warriors and you don't have enough, you'll simply add as many as you possibly can, and then the rest will be lost. So that's it for components. So let's have a look at setup. So the setup section here for Root is going to be a bit different to the setup I normally do because each faction has its own unique setup, and there's not actually a whole lot of generic setup that you're instructed to do. So the first thing you're going to do when you're setting up Root is you're going to decide who's going to play which faction. So I know this is cheating a little bit to show you this book here, but if you skip to page 22, what we'll see here are all the different scenarios it says that you can play with the different factions. So here you've got 2 players, 3 players, and 4 players. Obviously with 4 players you'll just be using all 4 factions. Right now, bear in mind these are only dealing with the factions from the core set here. These torches just indicate suggested combinations for people who haven't played before. So for example, the Marquise De Cat and Eyrie are quite low complexity, so this is a great starting point for 2 players if one or both of them haven't played before. And then with 3 players, again, it suggests you include the Marquise De Cat, who's sort of low complexity and will be easier to handle. Now, what you've also got here are some notes. Now it says scenarios, but really it's the same game just with the different factions. So there's no special rules that are applied to different combinations. They all follow the same basic rules. But what you've got here is some blurb telling you just what to expect from these different games as well. Then you randomly determine a starting player. Then you randomly determine a seating order, which is going to determine the turn order. However, everyone will set up in a very specific order, and that's important. So the first thing we'll need to do is get the board out. There it is, the Woodland. Now, there's a few things to note on the board here. We've got a victory points tracker. We've got up here an crafted item box. And then we've got all of these different clearings here. Now, we'll talk more about what's going on here in more detail when we get to the gameplay section of the video. For setup, you can include the whole deck of cards if you're playing with 3 or more players. However, in a 2-player game, there are cards in this deck called dominance cards. And in a 2-player game, you take all of these out. Many elements in Root refer to the suits. There are 4 suits in Root. The 3 denizens of the forest, that is rabbit, mice, and fox. Those are 3 of the suits. The 4th suit is bird. Now, in the Root deck, you'll find 1 dominance card matching each of these 4 suits. So here we've got rabbit, here we've got mouse, and here we've got fox. And lastly, we've got bird. Now, these dominance cards are essentially alternate victory conditions, and we'll get into more about that later. However, if you're playing a 2-player game, take them out of the Root deck. You will not be using them. However, with 3 or more players, shuffle them all in because you'll need them. Then we'll just stick this to one side of the board. Give it a good shuffle, and there we go. Next thing you can do, remember that little baggie of ruins I had? Let's get those out. So here I've got my 4 ruins. Now you'll notice these are the same shape as the building tokens from the game. They're the little squares. And if we have a look here, we'll see that in these clearings there are spaces for buildings to be built. And some of these spaces have a little R in them. So we're just going to take our ruins and cover up those spaces. Now this is important because it means that buildings cannot be built there. In a game with a Vagabond, the Vagabond will come and collect these tiles and then buildings can be put down. However, if there's no Vagabond, those tiles will remain there for the duration of the game, blocking those spaces off. And that's very important. Now we are also instructed to put these item tokens out here like this. Great. You'll also give each player 3 cards from the generic root card deck as well. This is their starting hand of cards. Each faction, no matter what faction they are, gets 3 cards to start the game with. So once that's done, everybody can set up their factions, starting with the player who has the letter of the alphabet closest to A. So the Marquise De Cat is A, and they'll start set up first. If there's no Marquis, you'll move on to B, which is the Eyrie Dynasties, and they'll start set up, and so on and so forth. C, which is the Woodland Alliance, until everybody's set up their faction. However, we'll look at how to set up the factions when we get to that section of this video later on. In the meantime, let's talk about the golden rules of playing Root. You can win Root one of 2 ways. Either be the first to achieve 30 victory points, at which time you'll win immediately, or acquire one of those domination cards we looked at earlier, dominance cards from this deck here, which you can play later on, and you can give up the goal of achieving 30 victory points and take on a different goal instead, which will be to control different areas of the board. We'll look at that a bit more later. Each faction has its own way of achieving victory points. There are ways that are unique to the factions that they can get victory points. There are also ways that are more generic. For example, crafting these cards will award almost every faction victory points. You can also gain victory points by removing your enemy faction's buildings from the board. Because Root is ultimately a game about conflict. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving around these different clearings here in the forest, trying to build our buildings, trying to remove our opponent's buildings and warriors from the board, and trying to leverage our positioning and the buildings that we're building to gain victory points and win the game. Now I have 5 warriors from the industrious Marquise De Cat's forces here, and I've got 5 proud warriors from the Eyrie Dynasties here. I'm going to use these warriors to teach you guys about movement and about conflict and about ruling clearings. For the rules explanation of this generic setup video, we will be ignoring any special rules that apply to these factions. These special rules will be covered when we get to the faction rundown after the generic rules are covered. First, let's look at clearings. Clearings are the main areas in which the game takes place. We're going to be moving around clearings on the board. We have to understand how they work, what they do, and more importantly, we need to be able to calculate who rules the clearing. Because ruling the clearing will give you bonuses and allow you to build buildings, so it's very important. So here you can see 4 clearings on the board. Now, these clearings are separated by forests, but there are paths running between them. There's also a river running up the board. For the core set here, we can ignore this river completely. It has literally no effect on gameplay and is purely artistic. It will come into play later when we look at the Riverfolk expansion. It's important to note that this is one clearing here and is not divided. Each clearing has a suit attached to it. This is important. So here you can see this is a fox clearing. Up here we can see this is a mouse clearing, and a bunny clearing up here, and over here another mouse clearing. Clearings also have a number of these white spaces in. These are places where buildings can be built. So for example, here we've got a ruins in this clearing, but the Eyrie Dynasty might want to build one of their roosts here later. That's one of their building types, and there it is in position in this clearing. You cannot build a building if all of these spaces are occupied. There's also no way to clear ruins unless there's a Vagabond in the game. Clearings are considered adjacent to one another if they're connected by a path, They are also considered adjacent to the forests that are around them. This clearing here is adjacent to 3 forests. This one here, and this one here. Likewise, this clearing here is adjacent to this forest here, this one here, and this one here. If we return the Eyrie's roost to this clearing here, we can put in some of the Eyrie's fine warriors here as well. Now, the Eyrie currently rules this clearing with a power of 4. And that is a sort of abstract state that's going to affect many different game elements as we move through the game. So that's very important to note who is ruling a current clearing. Now, in the event of the cats showing up, it's important to note that combat is not automatically triggered just because there are opposing forces in the clearing. Combat can be triggered by a number of other things, though. It's entirely possible for these 2 forces to coexist in this clearing. The Eyrie still currently rule it because they have 4 to the Marquise de Cat's 3. If the Marquise de Cat walks another warrior in here later, it's now 4-on-4, which is a tie. Now, in most circumstances, a tie means that nobody rules the clearing, and it's considered a draw with no ruler. So that's clearings. Now let's have a quick look at movement. Movement is very, very simple. When you move units around on the map, you can move any number of units with one move to one adjacent clearing. So if you take a move action, and pretty much every faction has a move action, you can take any number of warriors in a clearing and move them to an adjacent clearing. However, remember how we discussed ruling? Well, you must either rule the clearing you move out of, or rule the clearing you're moving to, or rule both. So, in this example, our Marquise de Cat player could take any number of these 3 warriors and move them to this clearing, or this clearing. Now, this one is ruled by the Eyrie Dynasty, but the Marquise de Cat rules this clearing, so the Marquise de Cat would be well within her rights to move these 3 down here, like this. She could also move just 1 or 2 if she preferred. It's up to her. She could also legitimately move in here. Nobody controls this clearing. Remember, I'm ignoring special rules for these factions at this time, so nobody rules this clearing, which means that she could move any number of warriors from this clearing that she rules into this clearing. However, the Marquise de Cat, if she had a move action, could not move this cat into either this clearing or this clearing, because this one is ruled by no one, this one is ruled by the Eyrie Dynasty, as is this one. So because she does not rule either of these clearings or either of these clearings, she cannot move this warrior here into either of these 2. She also cannot move this warrior here to this clearing because they are not adjacent. However, if the Marquise de Cat had 2 moves, she could spend 1 move to move these 3 in here. Now she controls this clearing. This means that she could then do a second move where she moves these warriors into this clearing here. So now that we understand how moving works, let's have a look at conflict, because we're going to be doing a lot of battling in Root. Now in this example here, the forces of the Marquise de Cat have shown up to take on the forces of the Eyrie Dynasties. It's 3-2, and the Marquise de Cat is the aggressor, who has initiated the battle. When you're doing a battle, you'll simply roll these 2 dice, and the higher number will be applied to the attacker, and the lower number will be applied to the defender. Marquise de Cat will roll both dice. So let's pretend for this example that the Marquise de Cat has rolled a 3 and a 2. The 3 will be applied to the Marquise de Cat as the attacker, and the 2 will be applied to the Eyrie Dynasties as the defender. This is the amount of damage that's done to the opposing force. Now, it's worth noting that a force can never do more damage than it has warriors. So if the Marquise de Cat had rolled 2 3s, and this was a 3 here, the Eyrie Dynasty would still only be able to do 2 damage because they only have 2 warriors. Then you simply remove pieces equal to the damage done, bearing in mind that pieces includes tokens, buildings, and warriors. In this case, 2 Marquise cats will die because the Eyrie Dynasties have done 2 damage, and the Eyrie Dynasties are going to lose all of their pieces from this clearing, leaving just 1 lone cat warrior left. Now, damage is applied simultaneously, so all of these pieces are removed regardless of anything that's killed. It's also worth noting that every building and token removed by a player earns that player 1 victory point. So in this case, we will be awarding the Marquise De Cat 1 victory point for destroying this roost. Any warriors that are killed are returned to their owner's supply unless otherwise specified. Any buildings that are removed are returned to the leftmost space on their building track on your faction board. So another element of combat to keep in mind is that if enemy warriors move into a clearing with a building that is undefended, this is known as defenseless. Any pieces in this clearing, if there are no allied warriors, are considered defenseless. So this would apply to tokens as well, such as the Riverfolk's trade posts or the Marquise de Cat's keep. If pieces are left defenseless, i.e. without allied warriors, then you automatically do 1 hit in addition to whatever you roll. So in this case, I would roll 2 dice, I would get the larger number, I would add a hit to it and do that many hits. Note that I will roll a dice for the defender, but because there are no warriors, they can't do any hits. Then those pieces, if I do any hits, and I will do at least 1 because they're defenseless, I will destroy that many pieces and I will gain the appropriate number of victory points. There are plenty of ways to affect the outcome of combat by crafting cards later on. These can give you additional bonuses in combat, or you may have a faction ability that helps you. However, for this example, we're just looking at the pure core rules and no faction special abilities. So we've covered clearings, movement, and combat, which are the 3 core principles of Root. Now that we understand that, we should take a look at these Root cards. And once we've had a look at the cards in a bit more detail, we can start looking at the factions. This is the Root deck here, and each faction will be drawing cards out of this deck and using them for different purposes on their turn. Cards have various different things going on. We looked at the dominance cards earlier. Let's have a look at one in a bit more detail in a minute. But let's take an example. We'll look at the top card here, Better Borrow Bank. Now, we know the suit from the color of the banner at the top here, as well as the symbol here. And suits are very important because you'll often be called upon to play cards from specific suits at specific times to trigger specific things. For example, the Outrage ability of the Woodland Alliance requires its enemies to pay the Woodland Alliance a card with a suit matching the clearing that they are moving into. So, in order to move into this bunny clearing here, a player would have to give a bunny card to the Woodland Alliance, which would be anything that matches this yellow banner and this symbol here. Most cards have a crafting ability as well. This and this are denoting the same thing, which is that if you want to craft this card, you will have to spend 2 bunny crafting resources. Each faction has its own way of getting resources, and we'll look at those in more detail in the faction rundowns. However, it's important to note that this gray box here indicates a persistent ability. So if your faction spends their 2 bunny symbols, however they might get them, you will then put this card face up near your play area, and you will have this ability going forward. Another thing that's important to note about these cards, here we see a permanent persistent upgrade that costs 1 of each symbol to craft. There are multiple copies of a single card in this deck, and if you craft 1, you cannot then craft the same card again. You can only have 1 of each named card in your play area. Some persistent effects are eventually discarded, and once it's discarded, you can then make another card of that type. We also have cards that look like this. Now you can tell from the banner at the top and the symbol this is a fox card. It also costs 1 mouse resource to craft. So this is a good example of a card where the suit and crafting cost are different suits. Now this is called Root T, and it's got a kettle here, and it says +2 then discard. So when this is crafted, it means that you'll take a kettle icon from the item box at the top of the board, and you'll gain 2 victory points, which will just be added to your total. The card will then be discarded to a communal discard that will be used to form a new deck of cards if this ever runs out. If you craft this, you will have this available for Vagabond. And now you'll go ahead and put this in the crafted items area of your player board. And it's important because if you can't take the crafted item from the items section here on the board, then you can't craft it. What this means is that once the teapots on the board run out, nobody can craft any more root tea. So the crafted item sections on the boards are always here in the top right hand corner, and when we craft the root tea, we'll just take the teapot from the board and place it over here in the crafted items section. If the Vagabond's in play, then this means the Vagabond will know that we've got it and he can come and trade for it. This also means that other players will know that there is a now teapot symbol missing from this area, and that means there's one less option for crafting in order to gain points. If by some miracle this crafting area were ever to be completely depleted, then you wouldn't be able to score points by crafting cards anymore. However, remember that some cards which are crafted which don't award victory points do not produce an item, so they can still be crafted. For example, Codebreaker's a permanent effect, does not result in the crafting of an item or points, so that's fine, you can continue to make that card, and it's the same with Favor of the Rabbits. This just kills your enemies and doesn't produce any items or victory points. Another kind of card in the deck are these ambush cards. Now there are 5 ambush cards in the deck, 2 bird suit ambush cards, and 1 of each of the other 3 suits. You can play an ambush in a clearing that matches the suit. Now, the thing about the bird suit is that you'll notice there are no bird clearings on the board. We've got bunny clearings, and we've got fox clearings, and we've got mouse clearings, but no bird clearings. That's because bird cards are typically regarded as wild. You'll need this bunny ambush card if you want to do an ambush in the bunny clearing. If you want to do an ambush in the mouse clearing, you cannot use this bunny card because it says you may ambush in a rabbit or bunny clearing. However, the bird card is wild, and you can tell it's wild because it says you may ambush in any clearing. You only play ambush cards when you are the defender. What this allows you to do is deal 2 hits before the combat begins, and what this is going to do is really swing it in your favor, because it means that they're unlikely to be able to get the 3 hits if you just killed 2 of their folks. However, you can always trump an ambush card with another ambush card. For example, if the Marquise De Cat initiated a fight here, the bird player might play this ambush card here, and this is going to deal 2 hits to the attacker. This would kill off both of the cats and mean there'd be no further conflict. However, fortunately, the Marquise De Cat has this bunny ambush card, so that can be used to cancel out this ambush card, and both are discarded. You've also got these dominance cards. Now, the dominance cards give you a new victory. The objective is to rule 3 clearings matching the symbol on the card, so that's pretty great. If you're trailing behind in victory points, and you don't know how you're going to catch up with the leader, then what you might do is after you've got 10 points, you can play this during your daylight phase and remove your score marker. You will no longer be able to gain victory points, and in fact you will gain this new victory condition at the bottom of the card here, which just says you win the game if you rule 3 fox clearings at the start of your bird song. So you can play this from your hand during your daylight phase if you have it in your hand. If you do not, it is discarded. However, instead of going into the discard pile, which is going to form the new root deck if we ever run out of cards, instead this will go face up next to the board, and during their daylight phase, anyone can purchase this by discarding a matching card from their hands. In this case, you would discard a fox card, and then you would gain this card here. So that pretty much covers the generic rules of root. I hope that's made it clear for you just how these core concepts work. And what we're going to do now is look at the factions in a bit more detail, so we should start with the Marquise De Cat. So the Marquise De Cat is a low complexity, moderately aggressive faction. And what the Marquise De Cat is essentially doing is managing a sort of economic network on the board. You'll be building buildings in the clearings, which are going to earn you victory points if you build many of the same kind of buildings. The buildings have 3 functions. You've got wood mills that produce wood. Wood is your primary resource, and you need it to produce more buildings. You also need to secure clearings, because you'll need to have lots of clearings that you rule to pass your wood through in order to continue building your buildings. So there's an element of on-the-board area control. You also have workshops that allow you to do crafting based on the clearings in which they're built. And finally, you've got recruiters, which allow you to recruit more feline soldiers, so you'll definitely want them. Now, here is the Marquise De Cat's faction board. You can see here that we'll be collecting 25 warriors, 6 of each building type, wood, and a special keep token as well, which is the keep where the Marquise De Cat rules the forest from. Here is your setup here, And the A denotes that if you're present in the game, you will set up your pieces first, no matter where you are in the turn order or relation to the starting player. And over here you've got your guide on how to play the Marquise De Cat. So if we go into my player bag here, we can find all of the pieces. Here are the tokens here. This includes the buildings and tokens. We've got all of our warriors here. And then what I've included here is a walkthrough, which is actually only used in the learn to play form of the game, so we won't need that. Get out of here. We've also got a little overview of each of the different factions. This is going to tell us a bit more information about them and gives you some tips on how to beat them as well. Now, in order to set up the player board, it's really very simple. Put your soldiers somewhere close by. They're just going to form a supply that you'll be drawing from over the course of the game. As the Marquise de Cat, the first thing we have to do is find somewhere to put our keep token. This has to be one of the corner clearings on the board. There are 4 like this, and we can use any of them. When we put down our keep, we put it anywhere in the clearing, but note that it does not take a space for a building. That is left open. Next up, we're going to put out 11 warriors, 1 in each clearing, except for the clearing that's in the direct opposite corner to the clearing we've just placed our keep in. So I'm going to do that now, so make sure you keep an eye on the board to see how it's done. So it's especially important to note that I've kept this clearing free. And that's because if we're playing with the Eyrie Dynasty, they'll deploy in that corner. Now we get to start with 3 buildings, 1 of each type. We're going to play these 3 buildings in any combination we like, in either the clearing with the keep or any clearing that's adjacent to the clearing with the keep. So we might put our recruiter in here, and our workshop here, and finally our sawmill can go in the clearing with the keep itself. We're going to take our remaining buildings and put them on the board like this. Every faction also has a VP tracker. We're going to take that and put it here on the 0 space of the VP track. The Marquise de Cat also comes with these 8 wood tokens. Just put these somewhere nearby because you'll need them. So that's it for the setup for the Marquise de Cat. Setup will then move on to the next player in setup order. Note that this might not reflect the actual turn order of the game. So let's have a look at what the Marquise de Cat does during the game. Earning the victory points under these buildings by building them on the board is the primary way in which you win the game. Some of these also have this symbol underneath them, which means that you can draw an extra card in the evening phase. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that when a building is destroyed, it's returned to the leftmost space of its track. Up here we have any special rules relating to the faction. Now it's really important to familiarize yourself with the special rules and to have a look at what's going on here. So the Marquise de Cat has the keep special rule, which says only you can place pieces in the clearing with the keep token. So this is really interesting, and it's just going to mean that your keep is extra well defended. It also means that players cannot reinforce easily in the clearing with the keep, even if they rule it. Then you've also got field hospitals. So field hospitals say whenever a marquee warrior is removed, you may spend a card matching the clearing to move the warrior to the clearing with the keep token. So if one of my cat people here in the fox clearing is killed, I can discard a fox card from my hand. So I'll give up this fox card here, and my dead warrior would move to this clearing here with the keep in it. Note that if the keep is destroyed, you can no longer use your field hospitals. The turn is divided into 3 phases: birdsong, which is the first phase; daylight, which is the second; and evening, which is the third. Now in the birdsong phase, all that the cat player gets to do is place 1 wood on each of their sawmills. So we'll just take this wood and we'll put it on the only sawmill we have. So then we've got what actually takes place in the daylight. The first thing you have to do is craft using workshops. Now you can't start doing the second set of actions and then go back. The Marquise de Cat crafts using workshops, and the workshops craft symbols match the clearings that they're in. For example, our workshop here is in a mouse clearing, which means we can craft a card which just costs a mouse symbol. For example, this root T. Now if we were to craft this root T, we'd take this kettle and would put it in the crafted items section on our player board. We would also gain 2 victory points and this card would be put in the root card discard pile. If you cannot craft anything, then so be it, and you'll move straight into the second stage of the daylight phase, which is take actions. The Marquise de Cat can take any of these actions up to 3 times, so you could take 3 battle actions, 3 march actions, or a combination of the 2. You can also recruit more warriors, so when you take the recruit action, now you can only take this once per turn. It's the exception to the rule that you can take these any number of times, but when you do take the recruit action, you'll gain a cat warrior at each of the recruiter buildings that you have on the board. Then you've got build, which says in a clearing that you rule, you can build a building by spending its cost in wood. So this is interesting. Let's have a look at an example of this. So here we can see that the Eyrie Dynasty has been invading the Marquise de Cat's clearings and spaces. Now what the Marquise de Cat would really like to do is build a recruiter in this clearing down here at the bottom. Unfortunately, they cannot get their wood here from the keep to this clearing because both routes go through clearings that are not ruled by the Marquise de Cat. So the wood can't get from here to where we want it down in the clearing down here. Fortunately, our Marquise de Cat does own this clearing up here. They with 2 presents to 1. So that means that they can spend this wood here to build a building costing 1 from their player board, putting it down in the free slot available in this clearing. Now that the Marquise de Cat has built this building, they'll gain 1 victory point. So now we're going to have a look at Overwork, which allows you to spend a card to place 1 wool at a sawmill in a matching clearing. So our Cat player decides she really needs more wood. She takes a look at her hand and she sees that she has a fox card here, which she can discard in order to put down a wood here at this sawmill in the fox clearing. So the Marquise de Cat can take 3 of those 5 actions. They can do any of them any number of times, with the exception of recruit, which can only be done once. And if the Marquise de Cat would like to do more than 3 actions, then you simply spend bird cards to take an additional action. After that, we're into the evening phase, where we can draw a card, +1 for each of these symbols showing on our player board. At this time we have none. And then we discard down to 5 cards. So the hand limit for pretty much every faction in the game is 5 cards, and if you ever have more than that at the end of your evening phase, typically you'll have to discard down. But this is cool because what it means is that if you gain cards on other players' turns, then you can still carry more than 5 into the beginning of your turn. The next faction we're going to look at is the Eyrie Dynasties. So here we've got the Eyrie Dynasties, and I've got the player bag I've put together for them here. The Eyrie Dynasties have some stats here. They're low complexity, they've got low card wealth, which means they tend to not have a lot of cards to play and craft. They're very high aggression, and although their crafting ability is not too hard to unlock, it's pretty useless, and you'll find out why in a minute. Here's some tips and information about how to play them. And so without further ado, let's get on with the setup. Do you remember how when we were setting up the Marquise de Cat, we kept the opposite corner to the keep free? Well, that's because the Eyrie sets up in one of the corners on the board, and it has to be opposite the keep if the Marquise de Cat is playing. If not, they can choose any of the 4 corners that they want to start in. So once you've chosen a corner to start in, just put down a roost there, and also 6 of your finest bird warriors. The remaining bird warriors can go near your player board to form a supply. The next thing we're going to have to do is go here into our leader stack. Now there are 4 leaders here, and each has a different ability. And you can see that they've got different names at the bottom as well. Now, very quickly, let's have a look at the Eyrie Dynasties special rules. First off, Lords of the Forest. You rule any clearings where that you are tied in presence. Well, that's great. That means if they have 2 warriors and I have 2 warriors, I rule the clearing, which is great and allows me to move around much more quickly with my armies because I'm less likely to be blocked because I don't rule any clearings. Now, the next thing here is disdain for trade, and what this does is that when we're crafting, we only get 1 victory point instead of the number we should get. And this is kind of a big drawback. However, there is one particular leader that lets us circumvent it. But just to clarify, when anyone else crafts this card, they're going to get 3 victory points, except for the Eyrie Dynasties, who are going to get 1. The builder leader here allows them to craft without suffering that penalty. So they can ignore their own handicap if their leader is the builder. But once you've picked your starting leader, you'll put them down here in your leader space. The other leaders will go face down near your board. And what we're going to be paying attention to is what's written here. So we've got move and build. So we'll take our two viziers here. These are our loyal viziers, and we'll place them into the move and build slots here like this. So we're almost ready to go, and we're just going to take our roosts here and put them into the remaining spots for roosts here on the Eyrie Dynasties board. Now that we've done that, there's only one thing left to do, which is to put our victory point marker onto the 0 victory point space. So that's set up for the Eyrie Dynasty. The Eyrie Dynasty actually is really interesting because essentially what you're going to be doing is programming, but it's a programming game where you have to build on your program every single turn. So you're adding 1 or 2 new cards to your program every turn and then trying to enact the whole thing successfully. If at any point you fail to complete a move in your programming, then you go into what's called turmoil. And turmoil has some pretty big penalties, but also you won't be able to avoid it the entire game anyway. So choosing when to go into turmoil and deciding how big of an inhibitor it's going to be in any given moment is pretty crucial to doing well with the Eyrie. But before we get to all that, first off, let's have a look at what happens to our Eyrie Dynasties player in Birdsong. So the Eyrie has their 3 phases. Here you'll notice that they have the same 3 phases as the Marquise De Cat, but they're very, very different in what happens during these phases. So the very first one is, if your hand is empty, draw 1 card. And if you'll remember, we start with 3 cards in hand, but if we had 0, we would draw a card here. Next up, it says add 1 or 2 cards to the decree. Only 1 card added may be a bird card. So this is where we look at the decree. These spaces up here where we put our loyal visitors earlier are called the decree, and this is the core of the Eyrie Dynasties play. Remember when I talked about programming? Well, programming is adding cards to this decree. On your turn, you'll move along the decree doing the actions listed. You can take each action once per card there, but you'll be restricted by the suit of the card. Bird cards are wild, which makes them very, very powerful. For example, if we have a fox card here in the recruit slot, then we must recruit a warrior to a fox clearing with a roost. However, if there are no fox clearings with roosts in, then this card will cause us to enter turmoil. It will also be discarded at that time. Every turn, the Eyrie player is adding cards to the decree, which means it's going to get more and more bloated and increasingly difficult to realize, especially as the other players are going to be looking for opportunities to prevent you from taking the actions that you have to take and thus sending you into turmoil. We'll look at what happens when you go into turmoil in a minute. After cards are added to the decree, there's a third step which says if you have no roosts, you can place a roost and 3 warriors in the clearing with the fewest total pieces. Now, bear in mind, pieces are anything that's listed on the back of your board, so that's your buildings, your warriors, your tokens, all of that stuff. And this is basically just in case you've been completely wiped out from the board or you have 1 or 2 warriors dotted around. You need roosts in order to recruit, so if you've been annihilated, you can put a roost down as part of your bird song. But that's unlikely to happen unless you're having a really bad time of it. Then we move on to the daylight phase where we can first craft using our roosts. So the way crafting works for the Eyrie Dynasties is they just check all of their clearings where they have roosts, and they can craft with those symbols. So in this case, they've got a rabbit clearing with a roost in it, which means that they can craft with a bunny symbol. After crafting has taken place, then it's time to resolve the decree, where we'll move through the columns from left to right. Here we have an example of 3 cards that have been added to the recruit column. When it activates a column, like we can see in the example here, it must do each of the actions in the column to complete the column successfully, which means in this case it will have to recruit a bird warrior into a fox clearing with a roost, here a mouse clearing with a roost, and here into any clearing with a roost. When you're thinking about programming your decree, you want to make sure you pay attention to these conditions below. For example, when you recruit, it has to be in a clearing matching the suit with a roost. When you move, it has to be from a clearing matching the suit of the card. So with this bird card, it can be any clearing, but if we were to put a card in here with a suit, for example, this dominance card, which can go in here, then we would have to move out of a rabbit clearing. Battle, again, it has to match the suit of the card here. So with this card, would have to have a battle in a fox clearing. And here, build is build a roost in a clearing with a matching suit again. So there's little stipulations under each of the actions that you must remain aware of, or else you're going to go into turmoil a lot. Finally, in the evening, we'll score VP for the rightmost space on the roost's track. We'll go down the roost track, we'll check how many we've got. In this case, we've got no roosts that we've built, just the roost we start with, which means we get no points. Every roost we build gets us another point, with the exception of the end here, where we have to build all of them to get up to 5. After the VPs are scored, we draw a card per symbol shown, and these are hidden under the roosts. If we can find these, we can draw more cards, and then we discard down to 5, because maximum hand size for each faction is 5 cards. So if you remember, the Eyrie Dynasty have a disdain for trade, which means that they only get 1 point for crafting unless you have the builder leader. However, all of the leaders have little bonuses on them, some of which give you extra victory points for completing certain objectives, or just alter your traits, such as the builder. The main way in which the Eyrie Dynasties score points are through their roosts. At the end of every turn, they gain victory points just for having roosts on the board. Now, because the roosts also allow them to craft, getting as many roosts out as possible is great for every single reason, because the more roosts you have, the easier it is for you to realize your decree, which means you're not going to go into turmoil, you can craft more stuff, and you're going to get more victory points at the end. Eyrie Dynasty is also a very aggressive faction, so they're going to be wanting to do a lot of attacking in order to destroy their enemies' buildings, because they can get victory points that way as well. So, turmoil. If you ever fail to enact an action here in the decree, you'll go into turmoil. You'll follow your turn up to the point where you get to resolve the decree, and then when you cannot resolve the decree, you'll go over here to turmoil, where it says, first off, humiliate. You'll lose a victory point for every bird card in the decree. Now, if we look up here, we can see that there are 3 bird cards in the decree, because you have to count loyal viziers as well. That's right. You will automatically lose 2 victory points because you'll always have your loyal viziers in the decree. So this is very harsh. So you'll lose 3 victory points. Then you'll discard all of the cards from the decree except for your viziers. So these will all be discarded to the discard pile, and you'll be back to just 2 cards in the decree. So your action economy is severely impacted. Next up, you'll depose your leader. So whoever is your leader at the moment will be flipped face down next to your player board, and you'll have to pick a new leader from the remaining leaders you haven't used. If at any point you discarded all 4 of your leaders, then you have what's called a new generation rule, where they all 4 become available again. But until that time, you'll have to use one that you haven't yet used. Once the new leader is chosen, you reassign your viziers to the correct columns, in this case move and battle. So we'll move a vizier over like this. And then you rest. Immediately end daylight and go to the evening phase. So the daylight is over, we go to the evening phase, where we'll score for our roosts and draw some more cards, and then wait for our next turn. Now, I think it goes without saying that we really want to avoid going into turmoil, so we really have to be mindful of the decree and the cards we're putting into the decree. However, there's also a real opportunity here for this faction to snowball into power by playing very aggressively, by moving their troops out across the board, making sure they get their roosts out and annihilate their opponent's pieces. But that just about covers it for the Eyrie Dynasties, so let's have a look at the Woodland Alliance. So you might see the Woodland Alliance as plucky heroes trying to overthrow the tyrannical rulers of the forest who have nothing but selfish agendas, or you might see them as radicalists, causing strife and rebellion in an otherwise peaceful area. So here we've got the Woodland Alliance board, and we've got 10 warriors, we've got 3 bases, we've got 10 sympathy tokens, and that's it. Now you'll note that they're high complexity, because they are quite tricky to play, and they are very good at crafting. That's important. Now here we've got some backstory, and then we've got our setup here, which is very, very small. In fact, setup is super easy. We just flip our board over like this. We take 3 cards off of the top of the deck. Note this is separate to the 3 cards we drew for our hand at the beginning of the game. We stick them here in our supporters pile like that. We take our warriors and put them nearby to form a supply. We take our 3 bases and put these out into the slots on the board. And we put out our sympathy tokens as well. Don't forget to put your VP token on the VP tracker as well. Now you'll note that it's interesting that the Woodland Alliance don't start with any of their warriors on the board or any board presence at all. That's going to happen on their first turn of the game. I'm going to run through the Woodland Alliance in order, but I just want to preface it by saying that the main function that they're going to have is by winning over their cohorts in the clearings. Now, it's really thematic. It's nice the way it fits in with the suits. You remember how all the clearings have suits? Well, that kind of notes which animals live there. So you got your fox clearing where the foxes live, you got a mouse clearing where the mice live, and that's awesome. The Woodland Alliance is, of course, made up of rabbits, mice, and foxes, and they're rebelling against the Eyrie Dynasties and the Marquise De Cats of the world who are trying to overthrow their woodland homes and tell them what to do, and they won't be having none of that. Thematically, the way this manifests is they're going to be putting out these sympathy tokens across the board, and you can put out these sympathy tokens in different ways, either by playing cards from your supporters deck that match the clearings in which you're placing them, and we'll talk about that when we get to step 2 of the birdsong phase, spread sympathy, or by organizing your soldiers in order to corral the locals up. I mean, you could sort of interpret this maneuver in different ways. Organize as in the locals into some kind of posse, or you use your warriors to organize the locals into falling in line. But whichever outlook you take, the point is still the same. You'll get these sympathy tokens all over the board. And what's cool about this, you're going to kind of be able to use this revolt mechanic to jump between the clearings, which is going to make it difficult for you to move around the clearings because of their outrage special ability. Because of the way that they use their officers for military operations, you'll see here in the evening they can take military operations up to the number of officers they have. It can be very, very difficult to perform actions that seem very simple to other factions. So they have this outrage special rule, and it says when a player removes sympathy or moves any warriors into a sympathetic clearing, that player must add a matching card from their hand to your supporters. If they cannot, they show you their hand and then draw a card and add it to your supporters. So here the Eyrie Dynasty wants to move their warriors into this sympathetic fox clearing belonging to the Woodland Alliance. Now, of course, they rule this clearing, so they are free to move in there. But before they can come in, they must put a fox card into the Woodland Alliance's supporters. So that's fine if they've got one. If they don't have one, they must present a hand without one, in which case the Woodland Alliance would take the top card from the root card deck and add that to their supporters no matter what it is. Note that if they had a bird card in their hand like this, the bird card would be counted because it's wild. It would count as a fox card, and they would have to add that to the Woodland Alliance supporters. And then you also have here the Guerrilla War special rule, which says that when the Woodland Alliance are the defenders in a battle, then they use the higher roll and the attacker uses the lower roll. And this just means that in combat, no matter who's the attacker and who's the defender, when the dice are rolled, the Woodland Alliance will always have the higher value. There are 3 phases, just like every other faction. So let's have a look at the revolt mechanic now. So the revolt mechanic is very important because it's the only way you can get your bases onto the board. And you spend supporter cards from your supporter's deck here, and then you can place the base in a clearing that matches the suit of the supporter cards you spent that also contains sympathy. So you're going to need to get your sympathy in the clearings first. But the cool thing about the way this works is that you can then jump your bases around different sympathetic clearings, so your opponents never really quite know where a revolt is going to pop up. However, they do know that it will be in sympathetic clearings, so they will know to be wary of that. If you put down sympathy in a clearing where they're present, they're probably going to want to stamp out that support really quickly so you don't have a revolt there next turn. Because when you revolt, you remove all of their pieces. In our supporters deck here, we've got a mouse card, a fox card, and a bird card. Now, bird cards are wild, so it can count as anything. That's great. We need 2 supporters in order to have a revolt. So this can be 2 mouse supporters, or this could be 2 fox supporters, which means we can spend either of these 2 sets here to have a revolt in a mouse clearing or a fox clearing. So let's have a look at an example of a revolt in a fox clearing. So here we see a situation where one of the Eyrie's fox clearings has got a sympathy token in it. Now clearly they haven't been diligent in stamping out the sympathy. Maybe they didn't have the cards in the decree in order to initiate a battle in this fox clearing, or maybe their attention was elsewhere. However, because they weren't able to put out the sympathy here, the Woodland Alliance will be able to have a revolt. First we'll need to spend those 2 fox cards, so we'll spend these cards and put them in the discard pile, and then we can remove all enemy pieces from this clearing. Whoa! They're all dead. That's amazing. This clearing is now the Woodland Alliance's clearing. So the first thing that happens is we're going to get a victory point for removing this building. Remember, whenever you destroy an enemy building, you get a victory point. That's great. The next thing that happens is that our base moves to this clearing. Now, in this case, our base is over here in this fox clearing down the bottom. But if it was on our faction board, it would also appear here. So no matter where it is, it moves up here. And this is a notable thing, because what this means is that wherever there's sympathy, you can move your bases around. Losing a base is absolutely devastating to the Woodland Alliance, so this is a very important technique for getting your base away from positions where enemies might attack it. But it also means that if you go around having revolts willy-nilly, you'll leave your bases vulnerable to enemy counterattack. Next, you can put down a warrior in this clearing for every sympathetic fox clearing. Now in this case we've got a sympathetic fox clearing down here. We'll say this is the only one we've got, which means we're going to get 1 extra warrior up here in this clearing as well. The final thing that happens as part of a revolt is we get to take an officer and put them into the officer's box here. Now this is very important as well, because pretty much all of our military actions happen during the evening phase. We can only do 1 military action for each officer we have here in the officer's box. So we really want to get some officers down in this box. Of course, we will have to maintain a balance, because the more warriors we have in here, the fewer we have defending our bases on the board. But for now, the evil Eyrie Dynasty has been thwarted and pushed back, and the foxes are free once again to be part of the Woodland Alliance. So what we're going to do now is look at spread sympathy and how we're actually going to get sympathy onto the board so that we can have these revolts. Because revolting is all well and good, destroying enemy pieces is very good, getting points for that is also good, but actually spreading sympathy is the core mechanic that we use to get points as the Woodland Alliance. So the second part of the Birdsong phase here is spread sympathy, and this is really important. We can do this any number of times as well. We spend a number of supporters listed on the sympathy track to place a sympathy adjacent to the sympathetic clearing if possible. So what this means is if we have no sympathy on the board, then we can put it anywhere. But if we have sympathy on the board, we must spread it to clearings adjacent to sympathetic clearings. Now, we spend cards equal to these numbers up here. So as we move down the sympathy track here, what we're going to start doing is getting more sympathy for the tokens we put out, but they're going to start becoming more expensive. Now, we have to spend supporters that match clearings, and we have to put them in adjacent clearings. So, for example, here we have a sympathetic fox clearing. We're going to have to start spreading sympathy into neighboring clearings, which means rabbits and mice. At the moment, the cost for spreading sympathy is 1 card. Unfortunately, we have a mouse card here, so we can pay that to put out this sympathy, which is going to get us 1 point. So we put this down adjacent to the sympathy we already have. It's worth noting here that the placement limits on sympathy prevent us from having more than 1 sympathy token per clearing. It's also worth noting that due to martial law, we must spend extra supporters if there are enemy warriors in the clearings. So if there are 3 enemy warriors from an enemy faction, 3 of the same type, so 3 birds or 3 cats in the clearing, we have to spend an extra supporter card. And so if there are 3 cats and 3 birds, we'd need 2 extra supporters, but 6 cats would just be 1 extra supporter. So once we're done spreading sympathy, we move on to daylight, in which we can start by crafting. So we craft by using our sympathy tokens. So in this case, we have 2 sympathy tokens here and here in the fox and mouse clearing, so we can craft something. For example, this card here costs 1 mouse, so we could craft this card, which would give us 2 victory points. And that would cost us our mouse sympathy. The sympathy would remain there. However, we wouldn't be able to use it to craft another card. It would be spent for this round. After we're done crafting, we can mobilize, which means we just take a card from our hand and add it to our supporter's stack. Note that we can always look at the supporter's stack to see what's in there, so we can sort of plan ahead and try and decide what we're going to do. There is a limit, only 5 cards maximum in the supporter's stack, unless we have a base on the table. If we have a base on the table, then we have an unlimited number of cards in the supporter's stack. We can also, after we've done mobilizing, adding a card to the supporter's stack, we can train, which means we spend a card from our hand matching one of our built bases to place an officer in the officer's box. Note that that comes from the supply here. So we'll just need to find a fox card in hand because we've only built the fox base at the moment, and then we can discard that in order to get another officer. And officers are really important. You want to have lots of officers. Now note that if a base is ever destroyed, we remove half of our officers rounded up. So we really want to be careful with those bases. Like I said earlier, you can't revolt with impunity because you might wind up leaving your bases in really vulnerable positions. Because then our evening phase activates, and of all the factions we've looked at so far, the Woodland Alliance have the most active evening phase. They've got their military operations. This is where they move, this is where they battle, this is where they recruit, and this is where they put out more sympathy again. So we've got the spread sympathy up here, which is slightly different, where we spend supporters to spread sympathy. Now down here we've got organize, where we can spend warriors to spread sympathy. And because this is not limited to suits, what I mean is that we can spend any warriors to add sympathy. This is really key as well. However, we can only take 1 action for each officer in the officer's box. So in this case, we've got 2 officers, so we can move once, battle once, recruit once, organize once, or, recruit twice. Now, recruit for the Woodland Alliance is very limited. We can only take 1 warrior here and put it at one of our bases. In this case, we only have 1 base, so if we recruit twice, we can only take 2 warriors and put them at the fox base. So that's it. Those are our 2 actions. We've recruited 2 folks. Moving and battling works very much the same way as we've already described, bearing in mind you've got the guerrilla war special rule. But other than that, remember you have to rule clearings as well, which is very, very difficult when you have such a limited pool of warriors. And organize just means spend a warrior to put out a sympathy. So we just recruited these 2 warriors. If we had another officer, we could take another action, spend this warrior to put out a sympathy token. Note that this does not require us to spend supporters, so this is a great way to get out sympathy tokens when you have the more expensive tokens to put out. Finally, you can draw 1 card plus 1 for each card symbol showing on your bases, and then discard down to 5. Well, we can only get a maximum of 4 card draw, so our card draw is not great, and we need to be using those cards for mobilizing and crafting. So card management is a really key part of being successful with the Woodland Alliance as well. Now remember, the enemies can destroy your sympathy simply by battling you and doing enough hits. If you leave your sympathy defenseless like this token here and they come in, then they can automatically destroy it because of the defenseless rule. The Woodland Alliance a bit trickier than the other factions we've looked at, but also a lot of fun to play and really rewarding when you get it right. Also very fun to sort of move around and pop up and revolt when people least expect it. So now let's move on and look at our last faction, the Vagabond. So finally you get to find out what these items do, because we're going to be looking at the Vagabond, a solo pawn who moves around the forests on the map, causing trouble and hijinks So you'll note here on the board that we have no warriors, buildings, or tokens. We are very special. We only have other pieces. Because the Vagabond pawn is not a warrior, it cannot be killed or removed from the board. You've got 7 starting items, which are items with a little S in the corner, 4 ruin items, which have a little R on it, character cards, and relationship markers. There's also a quest deck, which for some reason is not mentioned here. But the first thing we have to do is decide which of these Vagabonds we're going to be. The Riverfolk expansion comes with 3 more of these that you can play, but we'll just look at the ones from the retail set for now. So let's be the classic, Roger the Raccoon, the Thief. Then we look at our starting items down here, and we go and find the starting items. So these are the ones with the S's on them. So we've got our boot, our torch, teapot, and sword. So one of the special things about the Vagrant is that it can move through the forests. And after you've picked your starting character, you'll decide which of the forests you want to start in. Take your pawn and put it in one of those forests. So you'll have a look at where everyone else is set up on the board, because if you're playing in the retail version, you'll set up last. But we'll go ahead and we'll start in this forest here because it's nice and big, and we ignore the river. Remember, this is one forest, so we're adjacent to a whole bunch of clearings, and we can decide about where we want to go next. After that, what we're going to do is we're going to take the items with the R symbol on them, and these are going to be the loot hidden in the ruins. Remember how I said you can't get rid of the ruins unless you're playing with the Vagabond? Let's discover what's hidden in the ruins. So the Vagabond's going to collect these items, which essentially allow them to take actions over the course of the game. More on that later. For now, let's just look at how these are deployed. We're going to take our ruins tokens and put them over the top of these in order to obscure the item. We're then going to move them around randomly so that we don't know which item is which anymore. We're going to do this carefully, or we're going to have the other players do it, so that what's important is that the Vagabond player doesn't know which is which. Then we'll return these to the R-shaped spaces on the board. And these are going to represent little areas where we can go and find more items over the course of the game. When you're collecting items from the ruins, they've got a little R on them, and you can never have more than one item with an R that is the same. Now, in a game with just one Vagabond, this wouldn't come up, but in a game with 2 Vagabonds, it's possible that there'll be 2 sets of these ruins items, so you could get 2 R boots, but you couldn't pick them both up. If you found a second one, you would just have to leave it there for the other Vagabond to find. So now we'll flip our faction board here. We've got a special space for our thief card down here. We're going to take our starting items that we begin with, put them here in our satchel. The other 3 starting items you can return to the box because you won't need them for this character. This one here starts up here. You'll notice that teapots, money, and satchels go over here, but the items that match the symbols here go in the satchel, like this. We'll also find out who else is in our game. Let's pretend we're playing with the Eyrie and the Cat, and we'll put their faction symbols here in the indifferent box. This is the Vagabond quest deck. As part of setup, we're just going to take the quest deck and place 3 quests face up near the game board. These quests can be completed by the Vagabond in order to gain additional rewards. Just put the remaining cards nearby because you'll replenish these as they're completed. Of course, don't forget to put your VP token down here on the 0 VP space. So a few quick things to remember about the Vagabond is that you've got 2 special rules up here. The Lone Wanderer you already covered. You're not a warrior, you can't be killed. And you're nimble, which means that you can move around, ignoring the ruling rule. You can't really rule clearings, so you don't really care who rules clearings. You can just move around them as you want. So the core idea of the Vagabond is that you're going to be moving around clearings, and you can move through forests as well. However, you can't just move through forests willy-nilly. In fact, you can only really slip in and out of the forests. So they represent sort of like sanctuaries in which you can hide and repair your items. And we'll talk about items in a minute, but you can come out of the forests and then move around the clearings as you want, ignoring the rules for rulings, and then slip back into the forest if you need to go and recover from the exertions of your shenanigans. The Vagabond takes actions by exhausting items here in their satchel. So in order to take an action, if you want to move, for example, you exhaust your boot and just flip it face down like that. You've also got these 3 tracks here with items on. These are going to allow you to do greater numbers of things, and they sort of act like an upgrade. But note that these items can be exhausted as well, at which point they're moved from the track here into the satchel until they're replenished. So the very first thing that happens in the birdsong phase is that you can refresh 3 items. Refresh means to take an exhausted item and return it to its useful side. Now you can refresh 2 extra items for every pot of tea you have. That's going to be tea that's here on the track. So remember, when we exhausted it, it was moved to the satchel. So then it no longer benefits us. So we don't really want to exhaust tea if we can possibly help it, because it helps us to refresh more items. Once we've refreshed the items, we're going to have to think about which ones we want to refresh. What are we going to do this turn? What do we need? Then we can slip. Slip allows us to make a free move just from clearing to clearing, or move into the forest. This is the only way to move into the forest, so if we're going to go into a forest, now's the time. Note that this move into a clearing or forest comes at no cost at all. When thinking about slip, we should quickly look at the first step of the evening phase here, which says an evening's rest. If you're in the forest, repair all of your items. Now, items can become damaged. For every hit we take in combat, if we're on our own, we have to move items down here into the damaged box. Even items from here can be moved to the damaged box, and obviously this severely limits what we can do. However, if we spend our turn hiding in the forest, we can repair all of our items, which means moving them from the damaged box back to their appropriate places on our faction board. So really, we slip into the forest if we want to use it to jump across the board, or if we need to repair all of our stuff. So once we've decided whether or not we're going to slip, then we move into daylight, where we've got a whole plethora of actions that we can take. Move is the same as everyone else, except we ignore the clearing ruling rule, and we can only move for every boot that we've got. So early on we can just move 1 clearing, but we do have that free move up here as well. Our Vagabond can exhaust the swords in order to initiate a battle, which is pretty cool. But if we're going to initiate a battle, then if we don't have any men, our total hits are not equal to the number of warriors, but in fact equal to the number of undamaged swords. So if our sword is down here, it's useless to us. But for every sword, no matter whether it's exhausted or unexhausted, we have in our satchel, we can get that many hits in combat. So with just 1 sword, we only have a maximum of 1 hit that we can do. If we take any damage from the enemy, then any damage we take, we must put items here into the damaged box, 1 for each hit that we've taken. Then we've got the Explore here, and this is where we exhaust a torch, and we can use that to take an item from the ruins. So our Vagabond has decided to come in here and do an Explore action. This allows them to get the loot under here. Great, they've got this sword. They can add that to their satchel. Note that the ruin is not replaced. The ruin is removed from the game now that it's exhausted. This means this opens up another build slot for the players in this game to use as well. If we explore and we do get an item, we also get 1 victory point, which is great because that's how we win the game. The torch is used to activate your special ability. For example, on the thief here, the special ability is take a random card from a player in your clearing. So if your Vagabond pawn has entered a clearing with multiple warriors or buildings belonging to other players, you can activate your torch here, pick a player, and steal 1 of their cards at random from their hand. Now, Aid allows us to give cards from our hand to other players. And why would we want to do that? Well, when we give a card, we then get an item from them. Remember those crafting cards that everybody's making? For example, our friends the Woodland Alliance here have crafted this root tea. They're going to get 2 victory points, but they also get a teapot, which they put here on their crafted item space on their faction board. If we want to get that teapot from them, we're going to have to aid them, which means we have to enter a clearing where the Woodland Alliance has presence. Remember that presence is a piece, which is a token, a building, or a warrior, pretty much anything from the faction board, and then give them a card from our hand. If we do this, we gain the teapot from their board and can add it to ours. Note that if we offer aid to someone, we can take their faction marker and move it up the friendship track. And when we do that, we also gain a victory point. When we give aid, though, the card we give them must be of a suit that matches the clearing we are in. So here we are in a mouse clearing with a member of the Woodland Alliance. So we can give them this mouse card from our hand. In exchange, we'll gain a crafted item from their faction board, and we'll also gain one friendship with them. Note that in order to increase this relationship, we have to do it more than once, possibly. For the first rank, we just have to aid them once. However, if we want the next rank, we have to aid them twice in the same turn. So we're going to have to go and give them 2 cards. Note that this does require us to exhaust our equipment, but it says any, so we can exhaust any equipment in order to provide aid. So our next available action is quest. Now these have specific requirements, so let's have a look at those quests we set out earlier during setup. So if you remember the 3 quests we put out earlier, now in this case we've got 2 rabbit clearing quests and 1 mouse clearing quest. So we're going to go for the rabbit ones first because you get more points for completing quests in sets. You see, essentially all you have to do is find yourself in an appropriate clearing and then exhaust items matching the items here on the quest card. So we go into a rabbit clearing, we exhaust a torch and a teapot, and then we can take this card and it's now ours. We have successfully given a speech in the rabbit clearing. As a reward, we can draw 2 cards and we'll gain 1 victory point for every rabbit clearing quest card we have. In this case, just 1. However, next time when we're able to do the errand, then we'll gain 2 victory points because we've already got 1. This will go next to our player board to note that we've completed 1 rabbit quest. Then we replace it with a new quest. Another rabbit one. Brilliant. There are 4 quests for each clearing type. If we have a crossbow, then we can exhaust it to do a strike. Now a strike means that we can remove a piece in our clearing. So this could be warriors or buildings or tokens, anything on the board really. In a clearing, we can remove it by doing a strike. However, we must remove warriors first. So we can't go in and snipe roosts or anything like that. We'll have to take out the warriors. However, if we are able to exhaust it to remove a building or a token, then we will get a victory point for that. Finally, we've got the hammer symbol here, and this is how we craft. This is also how we repair. They're really bad at crafting, to be honest, the Vagabonds. Really, they want to be going around aiding people to gain the items that other people have crafted. But we can exhaust this to repair an item, so if something's become damaged, we can just go ahead and repair that by exhausting this. And when something's repaired, it becomes unexhausted and moves up to the satchel. So that's now something else we can use, which is great. We can also use this to craft. And when we use it to craft, we exhaust it and add a symbol to our crafting pool equal to the clearing we're in. So if you remember, we're here in the mouse clearing. If we had a card that cost 1 mouse symbol, then we could use this to craft it. If we had more than 1 hammer, we could exhaust multiple hammers to get more than 1 crafting symbol. So this means that the Vagabond cannot craft things that require him to have multiple symbol types. So when you get to the evening part of the Vagabond, if you are in a forest, you can repair all of your items. If you're not, you can't. Then you can draw a card, plus 1 card for every coin that you've collected. These are just like the teapots. You find them in the ruins, or you can collect them from other players' faction boards, and when you get one, you just put it down here. Again, they can be exhausted if you must exhaust them for whatever reason, or damaged if you take damage from enemies. Then you discard down to 5 cards in your hand. Everybody has to do this all the time. 5 cards is maximum hand size for everyone. And then you remove items in your satchel down to 6, plus 2 for every bag you've collected. So this prevents you from going and getting a million items down here and being able to run totally wild, doing a million things every turn. However, you can get up to 3 bags, which means you can collect up to 12 items in your satchel, which is very strong, but you'll need to find these again on other players' boards or in the ruins. So what we haven't talked about is relationships, and this is incredibly important. Now, I've mentioned briefly about how you can gain friends by aiding them, and you aid, if you do 1 aid, then you go up to level 1. If you do 2 aids in the same turn, you go up to level 2. And if you do 3 aids in the same turn, you'll go up to level 3. And then you'll get plus 2 victory points, and then you'll be allied. And allied is great because essentially it means you can commandeer your allies' armies. If you are allied, then you can enter a clearing with the allies' armies, and you can move them around and attack other players as though they were your soldiers, and that's awesome. There's a few things to note. There's a few catches here. Number one, if you're allied with someone, you cannot use their soldiers to attack their soldiers. So if you're allied with the Marquise De Cat, you cannot use the cats against the cats. That's just not how it works. Furthermore, if you as a person ever attack someone's soldiers, or if you use your allies to attack someone's soldiers, they will immediately move to hostile. When you are hostile with another faction, then you must spend an extra boot in order to move into clearings with them, and also you gain a victory point for every hostile piece you kill. So you'll probably wind up wanting to be hostile with at least one faction so you can score some points that way. If you take your allies into battle with someone that you are hostile against, then any wounds you take are split between your allies and yourself. However, if your allies take more wounds than you do, they will immediately move to hostile. In this example here, our Vagabond is allied with the Eyrie Dynasty. She's going to be able to take these Eyrie Dynasty soldiers here and move with them wherever she wants to go. She's decided that the Woodland Alliance are too far ahead in points, and she's going to do something about it. So she's going to commandeer this army and move in here with them. Then she's going to have a battle and hopefully kill some Woodland Alliance soldiers. Note that in order to move in here, she's going to have to exhaust 2 boots, one to do a move action and one because the Woodland Alliance are hostile. Then, if she wants to do a battle, she's going to have to exhaust a sword symbol, but because it's not damaged, this will still allow her to increase her combat total. However, because she's with 3 Eyrie soldiers as well, her total is 4, which means that she can keep all of the hits because the maximum hits she can roll is 3. The Woodland Alliance can also roll up to 3 hits, so let's see what happens. So we've rolled a 2 and a 3. Now if you recall, the Woodland Alliance have the guerrilla warfare tactic, which means they've done 3-hit damage to our Vagabond and the Eyrie soldiers that have done 2. That means 2 Woodland Alliance are going to die, and our Vagabond is left with a tough choice. She could kill off all 3 Eyrie soldiers, but then the Eyrie would become hostile towards her as well. If she wants to remain allied with the Eyrie, she's going to have to kill off just 1 Eyrie soldier and then damage 2 of her pieces of equipment. As you can see from the indicator on the board here, it's entirely possible to go from allied just all the way down to hostile. The other advantage of being allied with a faction is that if you go and aid them while you're allied with them, that is, go into a clearing and give them a card matching the clearing type. So, you go into the mouse clearing, give them a mouse card. For every aid that you give them, you gain 2 victory points. And if you're no longer allied, you won't be able to do that anymore, so you'll lose that option for victory point revenue. So I think that just about covers the Vagabond. It's a interesting class to play. It's sort of manipulating the game. There's a lot of opportunity to upset the balance of power or throw off people's strategies, but you've got to try to make sure that you don't upset the balance too much, because you could help someone just run away with a landslide victory and then miss your own opportunity to win the game. You're going to need a bit of time to find your items, to develop your relationships as well so that you can start scoring points. You will also want to find all of the items that go on this track are really important. The satchels are great because they give you more items, which give you more options. The teapots are great because they allow you to refresh more items, which means you can take more actions on your turn. And of course the money is great because it allows you to draw more cards so you can aid the other players more, which means that you can develop your relationships more effectively. Just don't hyper-focus one relationship too much, because if you're just feeding cards to one player over and over again, you're really going to upset the balance of power, in which case, that player could develop a runaway lead. The final thing is the dominance card. There's a special rule for the Vagabond, which allows them to form a coalition in games with 4 or more players. A coalition is essentially just where you become someone's ally. So you give up your victory point token, you can't score victory points anymore, but you continue to play as the Vagabond, and if the player you formed a coalition with wins the game, then so do you. However, you can only form a coalition with a player who has the least victory points in the game. So, by teaming up, you're also going to have to take on the person who's losing the worst, and then you'll have the biggest improvement that you'll have to make. So, is it really worth it? Well, I guess that depends how you're doing. You might be doing even worse than they are. So I think that pretty much covers the Vagabond. We can have a quick talk about the Winter board, and then we will go on to the Riverfolk expansion. So as you can see here, I've prepared the Winter board. I've put out my items up there. I put out the 4 ruins here on the board and the ruin spaces as well. How does this differ from the Autumn side? Well, aside from the fact that the river is different, again, that's irrelevant unless we're playing with the Riverfolk expansion, with the Riverfolk faction. The really important thing to note here is that none of the clearings have suits, and that's where these little tokens here are going to come in. Because, as you can see, I've put them face down, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go around the board, applying these face down to the clearings. And when I'm done this, I'm going to flip them all face up. And this means that the clearings have randomized suits. And the impact on the game of this is going to be that they are not balanced in the same way as on the Autumn side of the board. This creates new strategic considerations for the players. As the clearings are randomized, you're going to have to think about what this means for your faction. You're going to have to look at the board and think about what this could mean for you in terms of gameplay. This is only recommended for advanced players because it really is more strategically demanding. You're going to have to know the factions better. You're going to have to be able to look at this board and assess what factions are going to gain an advantage from this different layout, what factions are going to have a penalty from this layout, and, adjust your strategies accordingly. You also want to look and see how this could give you an advantage, so you're going to have to know your faction pretty well as well. So this is really only recommended for players that know the game really well, but it's really nice to have this option, and it's very cool that they included it. We've covered everything in the core set. Now we're going to cover the Riverfolk expansion. So in this box you get another Vagabond, so you can play with 2 Vagabonds if you want. And it comes with new characters for the Vagabond. So you saw 3 in the core set. There's 3 new ones as well. I'll show you those really quickly. Otherwise, the Vagabond is exactly the same, so I'm not going to run down the rules for that. If you want to know the rules for the Vagabond, check out the section on Vagabond in the core set. And then we'll have a look at the 2 new factions, the Riverfolk expansion and the Lizard Cult. And then, last but not least, there's the Mechanical Marquise De Cat. So we'll have a look at her as well. And how she functions is actually very, very simple, which is really cool. And then that'll just about cover it for the Riverfolk expansion. So we've got a new Learning to Play guide. We won't need that except to check the possible setups of the scenarios here. So you've got 3-player options and 4 or more player options. And it just says here that you can take any 3-player mix and add any remaining 1, 2, or 3 factions, or just use these recommended. So you can pretty much do whatever you want. It's just that they have some recommended options here. And the same with co-op mode. Co-op mode is for 2 to 4 players. But there's also solitaire mode as well. And you can actually play competitive mode and then just swap the Marquise De Cat for the Mechanical Marquise if you want to just play with the AI instead of a real person. And then we've got the Mechanical Marquise player board, and this is pretty cool, you can see here. If you're wondering why it's double-sided, this is the Mechanical Marquise side here, and the other side here is actually for the Winter board from the core set, and that's why he's got a fluffy cape on here. But also that's just because the clearing priority chart here changes for the Winter side, as you can see. I've got a second Vagabond player board here. It's the exact same as the other one. Then we've got a Riverfolk player board here. That's pretty cool. The Riverfolk company. And the Lizard Cult as well. There they are. That's awesome. Here we've got the Lizard Folk pieces with their funky warriors. And we can see here that they've got 25 warriors, the same number as the Marquise De Cat. That's loads. They've got the gardens here, and that's how they're going to win the game, by making gardens to convert you to their beautiful cult, and 1 outcast marker as well. More about that later. They are a complex faction with moderate aggression, and they're great at crafting and drawing cards. Here we've got the Riverfolk. They've got some little icons here, and they've got these round tokens for building trade posts. I've also got here the other Vagabond. So this Vagabond is a pale Vagabond instead of the dark Vagabond that comes in the core set. And you've got 3 new classes as well. You've got the Badger Arbiter, who's really cool. You've got, I don't know what this guy is, but he's creepy, and he's kind of, he just looks really excited. I kind of like him. That's the Vagrant. And finally the Scoundrel, who's clearly a cat hiding from the Marquis by wearing a pumpkin on his face. I really like his ability though, Scorched Earth. He throws down his torch, and then nobody can put anything in that clearing anymore. It's like, this clearing is done now. He's mad. He's a total maniac. Finally, we've got some spy cards. These are used in lieu of the dominance cards with the Mechanical Marquise, because obviously if you're playing with the AI, you can't really use the dominance cards unless you're playing in the competitive mode. But if you're playing in a co-op mode or solitaire mode, you'll use these spy cards instead, which allow you to spy out what the AI is doing. There's also all these little lettered tokens here, and I've been advised that these are not used in any of the actual games that are present here in these 2 boxes, but these are included for possible future scenarios, which will be available on Leader Games' website, so check that out. Finally, we've got 5 of these card holders here, and you need one of these for the Mechanical Marquise, so I guess the other 4 are just a nice additional thing to include with the game. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the Lizard Cult, because they come first in the setup order, after Vagabond, before the Riverfolk Trading Company. So the Lizard Cult are quite different to the other factions in that they don't move and fight in the same way. They're really more about sort of spreading presence over the board. It's one of the factions that most closely resembles the more low complexity factions like the Marquise De Cat or the Eyrie Dynasty, and yet sort of subverts the core mechanics in really sort of subtle but potent ways. It's very difficult for them to move around the board and very difficult for them to engage battles. But they just kind of spread out, causing problems for the other players and forcing the other players to deal with them. For setup, you find a corner opposite the Marquise De Cat, and if the Eyrie Dynasty is already there, then you pick one of the other 2 corners. You take 4 warriors, and you put 4 warriors in that corner, and then also a matching garden. So this is a mouse one, so we'll take a mouse garden here and put it down. Then you take 1 warrior and put it in each adjacent clearing. I say warrior, I should really say cultist. And then once you've done that, you can flip this over. Next, you choose where the outcast marker is going to go. Now, the outcast faction is going to change around, but the way this kind of works is that your abilities are tied to the outcast faction, so you're sort of railroaded into what you can affect every turn. And the outcast marker is going to move to the faction that's been most sort of targeted. It's quite clever the way it's done, but more on that later. Suffice to say, at the start of the game, you probably want to pick the outcast faction as a clearing that contains a lot of your opponent's pieces. So, obviously I haven't set up any opponents on this board, but if they were all in the bunny clearings, we would pick bunny. And that would probably be a pretty good choice. And then what we do is we just put the rest of our gardens out here on the board. Don't forget to put your VP marker on the VP track. So there are some very cool and interesting rules going on here with the Lizard Cult. The first is revenge. When your warriors are removed because they're defending, they become acolytes. So anyone who dies goes into this box here instead of just being returned straight to the supply. That's really important. Note that this is only the defending warriors and not if you attack. Furthermore, they have a hatred of birds. Their bird cards are not wild when involved in rituals. Note that rituals are what we call our actions here in the daylight phase. So when you're doing any of this stuff, your bird cards are not wild and in fact only have one function down here. More on that in a minute. Then pilgrims. You rule any clearings where you have gardens. That's huge. Essentially, we're moving around the map building these gardens which are going to purify the map and bring people closer to the holy god of the lizard cult. And no matter what, they rule a clearing with a garden in it. This even overrules the Eyrie's draw rule. That means the more gardens you get out, the more difficult it is for your opponents to move around. Because if their whole army gets caught in a clearing and you throw down a garden, now suddenly they may not be able to move out, and they're going to have to stop and destroy that garden. A very important thing to note with the lizard cult is this box here called the Lost Souls. Now, the Lost Souls is what determines where this outcast token goes. And the outcast token determines what conspiracies you can do. The way it's going to work is that during the birdsong phase, we're essentially going to be able to use our conspiracies against clearings that match the outcast symbol. The only way for the lizard cult warriors to move around the board is using this crusade. And the only way to do a crusade is to spend 2 acolytes. So first, you have to lose warriors defending in battle, and then you can use them to initiate a crusade. When you initiate a crusade, you can have a battle in a clearing that matches the outcast position here. Or you can move warriors from a clearing that matches the outcast symbol into an adjacent clearing and then have a battle. Let's look at an example. In this example, we've just decided to do a crusade. We can have a battle here in this clearing because the current outcast symbol is bunny, and this is a bunny clearing. We could also take our warriors from this clearing and move them down here to this fox clearing containing the Woodland Alliance because they're coming from a bunny clearing. However, this is probably a bad tactical decision because it leaves our garden undefended. So the outcast symbol is not something you can actually control. It's controlled by the cards discarded by other players. When a root card is discarded, instead of going into the discard pile like it normally would, instead these cards are added to the Lost Souls. And when it comes to the lizard cult turn, the very first thing that happens is adjust the outcast. So the way Adjust the Outcast works is that we look at the cards in the Lost Souls. We find the most common suit. Note that birds have no impact on this. And we adjust the outcast symbol to the most common suit. So in this case, the outcast would become mouse. This means that all of the conspiracies are restricted to mouse clearings. If we were to reveal mouse again next turn, then the outcast symbol would flip over and mouse would become the hated outcast. And the hated outcast means that we can do our conspiracies at a cheaper cost. So that's good for us as the lizard cult. In the event that there are no cards in the Lost Souls discard pile, or if there's no clear majority in the Lost Souls discard pile, the marker will stay where it is and will not change and will not flip to the hated side. However, we have little control over this, so we're going to have a strategy that's quite flexible and allows us to utilize this information. Once we're done adjusting the outcast, these are moved to the discard pile where they should be. And then we'll just let the cards build up again in the Lost Souls until we adjust the outcast token again next turn. So that's step 2 of Birdsong, discard the Lost Souls. Step 3 is perform conspiracies. So I already talked about the Crusade and showed you an example of that. The other 2 conspiracies are convert. So when I convert, I spend 2 acolytes and they're returned to my pool. But then I can select a clearing that matches the outcast symbol and take an enemy warrior there and replace it with one of mine. They follow the lizard god now. The final conspiracy is sanctify, which costs 3 acolytes. So we return to the mouse clearing because this is the outcast symbol. I take 3 acolytes from my acolyte pool on my faction board and return them to the warrior supply. And then I can choose an enemy building and it is removed from the game. Note this gets me a victory point. And then I can replace it with a garden. So those are obviously very powerful abilities, especially if one of the clearing types becomes the hated outcast, and then I can crusade and convert for just one acolyte and sanctify for just 2 acolytes. So that's a really good deal. But we can't just be crusading around the board the whole time. I mean, we probably won't have that many acolytes. In fact, if our opponents know that we can use our acolytes to do all these cool, powerful things, they're probably not going to kill us, right? So in the daylight phase, we can reveal cards from our hand to perform rituals. For each card we reveal, we can do different rituals. And we can build, which means place a garden in a matching clearing that I rule. I can recruit, which means place a warrior in a matching clearing. And score, 1 per suit per turn. It's important to note that I can only score 1 suit per turn. This is our primary way of getting victory points. When you discard a card to score, you score the rightmost empty space based on the column it's in. So for example, if we were to discard this mouse card to score, we would gain 2 points because this empty space is in the 2 points column. The bunny card would get us 3 points. As you can see, it's in the 3 column. Fox card would get us no points because 1 garden gets you 0 points. However, when we reveal cards, we don't necessarily discard them. In fact, scoring is the only way to discard cards for the Lizard Cult. If they want to build a garden, then they just play the matching card, and they can build a garden in the matching clearing. However, they have to rule it in order to put the garden down. But this revealed card will return to their hand momentarily. Similarly, if they put down the fox one, they can put down a fox garden, or they can recruit a warrior to any fox clearing. Just says place a warrior in a matching clearing. Finally, the bird card allows them to remove a warrior from the board to become an acolyte. So if the opponents really are boycotting you and aren't attacking you at all, this is a way for you to get acolytes, although it's not very efficient, and you have to recruit people and then kill them. Now, this is why the hatred of birds is incredibly important, because when you're doing your rituals down here, you've got to be playing fox, bunny, or mouse suits to build, recruit, and score. You can't play bird cards to use as wilds in this section. Well, what's notable is that the first step of the evening phase says return revealed cards to hand. So this is everything that you revealed, which is build, recruit, and sacrifice. All of these are just revealed cards, so these are all going to return to your hand. The only cards you won't collect are any that were discarded to score points. In the crafting phase, you have a number of suit symbols equal to the number of gardens you've placed that are in the same suit as the outcast suit. What this means is that you can never craft a card that requires multiple suits. Finally, you can draw a card, and then you also gain a card for every card draw symbol you've revealed by placing gardens. Then, finally, discard down to 5. So the Lizard Cult really are sort of a slow grow kind of deal. Once the gardens start to come out, it becomes very difficult for your opponents to maneuver around because you rule so many of the clearings. They can't move in and out very easily. However, until you get those gardens out, it's very difficult for you to score points, because the main ways you have of scoring points are by scoring the gardens, by discarding suits from your hand, or by crafting, which also requires you to have gardens out. So you really have to protect those gardens. Unlike the situation for the Woodland Alliance, where losing one of their bases is a big deal, the Lizard Cult have 15 gardens, which is a lot more than 3 bases. And losing a garden is not that big of an issue. I mean, it's not a small issue, but it's not catastrophic. Let's look at an example. If the Eyrie Dynasty rock up into this clearing and decide to initiate a battle, and they roll a 3 and a 1, then they're going to lose 1 bird, and the Lizard Cult are going to lose everything. Now remember, these guys are going to become acolytes because they were defending, and this garden is going to return to its position on the board. When a garden is removed from the map, we just discard a random card from our hand. Not nearly as bad as, say, the Woodland Alliance, who lose all those officers and supporters. All we do is we fan our hand out face down, and we let our opponent pick a card, or we just pick a card and randomly discard it. Now remember, you can only score each suit once per turn. And that's annoying because If you've got a lot of gardens of a particular suit on the board, you want to score them as many times as you can. But that's probably why that's a rule. It is upsetting when the card you discard at random because a garden was destroyed was one you were planning to score on your next turn, and now you can't. However, you have just got a bunch of acolytes for defending that garden. So don't leave your gardens defenseless, because then you'll lose the garden and the card, but you won't gain any acolytes. Make sure you leave at least a couple of guys, maybe even just one in each clearing, so you always get a little something out of it. Because acolytes are a great bonus. Remember, they can sanctify and convert, so you can always use your acolytes to get more gardens and acolytes. Pay close attention to where these card symbols are as well, because you're going to want to draw cards in order to make sure you can score your suits and build and recruit at a click pace as well. The easiest card to get is the Fox card, so getting some Fox Gardens out early on is very potent. Then it's Bunny, then Mouse. So that's a pretty good way to prioritize the order in which you build your gardens. But the Lizard Cult, because of their ability to recruit in any clearing, even ones that they don't rule, that's very cool. That's a lot of fun, and it really gives you this feel of sort of spreading a nefarious religion around the forest. But I think that just about covers it for the Lizard Cult. So let's talk about the Riverfolk. So the Riverfolk are really cool because they're a non-aggressive faction. They're an economy-based faction, and they're really all about making money and sort of playing war profiteers. And they're really, really interesting because they actually score the most points by not fighting and not even taking any actions, but by just saving up their money and letting it accumulate. Of course, if you save up too big of a fund, then you're going to present yourself as a big threat to your enemies, and they're going to come and try and ruin that for you. So the Riverfolk set up last of all of the factions in the game. They get 15 warriors, no buildings, they get 9 trade posts and 3 service markers. So I've put together a little player baggie with all of their stuff in it here. Now, in order to set up, we just put 4 warriors in any of the clearings which are on the river, and then we put 3 warriors in our payments box and set up our service markers and put out our trade posts. So let's do that now. So here I've got my 4 Riverfolk warriors. Now I can put them in any clearings on the river. So I could put all 4 of them down in the same spot. Or I could have 2 of them here and 2 of them here and maybe send one of them off up the river somewhere else. But it's up to me how I want to lay them out at the start of the game. Let's put all 4 in here for now. And then we flip over our board here. And we're going to get 3 of our warriors here in payments. And the rest will just form a supply for us to draw from later. Next, we're going to set up our service markers, which are these 3 here. Now, what you want to be doing is you're going to be looking at the hand of cards you're dealt at the beginning of the game, trying to decide how desirable it is, because people will be buying your cards from you. Does that sound mad? It's pretty mad, but the bird ambush card is really, really strong. So I'm going to set this to 3, meaning that it's now quite expensive. Then we've also got riverboats and mercenaries here, more on that later, but that's not very strong right at the start, so I'm just going to put 1 down on riverboats because I want to make some money, and 2 on mercenaries because I don't want all my people to be killed. I'll explain how I've made these decisions in a minute and what these other 2 things mean. But these cards are going to be placed face up somewhere where all the players can see them, because these are for sale. The final thing I'm going to do is take my trade posts and set them up on my board here in the correct columns. So my bunny trade posts go here, my fox trade posts go here, mice down at the bottom. Last but not least, I'll put my victory point tracker here on the victory point bar. So the way that the Riverfolk Company basically works is we use warriors as currency. The warriors are going to move around on our board and allow us to do different things and purchase stuff. We've got a few interesting notes up here at the top. For a start, for sale, we have a public hand. Our hand is for sale. Please buy our cards. Secondly, swimmers. We treat rivers as paths and may move along rivers regardless of who rules the clearings on the rivers. Much like the nimble Vagabond, we can ignore the ruler rule for movement, but only when we're moving along rivers, which only we can do, right? During our birdsong phase, the very first thing that happens is protectionism. If our payments box is empty, we can put 2 of our warriors into the payment box, provided we have them in the supply. This is not ideal, but, it's better than nothing. However, we start with 3 in there, so we'd skip this step on the first turn. Next up, if we have any trade posts out on the map, we would score 1 point for every 2 warriors in the funds box. There are none in the funds box at this time, but if we were to say have 4, we would get 2 victory points. So keeping things in the funds box at the end of the evening phase is good, because it means come the birdsong phase next turn, we're going to score victory points. Finally, gather funds phase. In this, we move all of the warriors on our faction board into the funds box. At the moment, that just means from payments into funds, but later in the game, we may well have warriors here in the commitments box, and we may well have warriors here on the trade post spaces as well, and all of these warriors would move into the funds at this time. Note that it's also going to be the case that we may have warriors from other factions on our board, and I'll explain how that happens in just a minute. But after we've gathered together our funds, we then have a number of options for our actions here, and they're pretty standard for the factions in this game. We can move, so we commit a fund in order to move. Note that that's important, commit a fund. And that would give us 1 move action, so we could move 1 group of soldiers from one clearing to another. So we could grab a number of these guys and move them up to another clearing, for example. We can also commit a fund to battle, and then we could initiate a battle in a clearing somewhere. We can also commit a fund to craft. However, in order to craft, we have to build trade posts. So when it comes to crafting, we have to use funds to craft. Instead of moving them to the commitments, we will commit them to our spaces over here. And what this means is that we've now unlocked 2 fox symbols with which to craft. We could craft a card that costs 2 foxes. However, in order to do this, we will first have to have built the trade posts. Next, we can commit a fund to draw a card. And when we draw a card, we take the top one from the deck and we put it face up next to the other cards. We can recruit. We can spend a fund. When we spend a fund, we actually take it from the board and add it back to the supply. Note that this is different to commit a fund. And when we spend a fund, we take a warrior and place it in any clearing with a river in it. So we can just grab this guy, put him down up there if we want. Our final action is establish trade post with a garrison. So in order to establish a trade post, I need to spend funds, and the funds need to match the clearing's ruler. Now remember I talked about how I could have funds that were not my own warriors? Well, maybe I've got some Eyrie funds here. So what's notable about the Eyrie funds is that I can spend these to establish a trade post in a clearing that's ruled by the Eyrie. Now, if I establish a trade post, first off, I have to spend 2 funds that match the clearing's ruler, and then I can put down a trade post that matches the clearing's suit. In this case, I'm going to put down a mouse one. So here is my Eyrie clearing. I'm going to put down this trade post. It comes with a garrison, so I also get a warrior from my supply who goes down here as well. I have to spend these 2 funds in order to do it, and they'll be returned to the Eyrie Dynasties warrior supply. I get 2 points for placing a trade post. Now, I can always spend my own people to put down a trade post in clearings that I rule. So you can see the importance of gaining funds that are warriors from the other players' factions. Now, this is really important. So how do we get those funds? Well, in our evening phase is very, very short. We discard down to 5 cards in hand. Note that that's our face-up hand here. And then we set our service prices, which are these things here. You see, there are 3 things other players can buy from us. They can buy the cards in our hands. They can buy the right to use the rivers, which allow them to move on the rivers just as the Riverfolk do. Or they can buy the right to use us as mercenaries, which is much like when the Vagabond becomes an ally. So when they buy us as mercenaries, they can move our soldiers around with their, just as though our soldiers become their soldiers for all intents and purposes. So they can move us into conflicts, they can start battles with us, they can move us around as they see fit, provided it follows their rules. So this is very difficult for the Lizard Cult because they can only move and engage in fights with crusades. But it's very easy for someone like the Eyrie who have got the decree, which gives them lots of actions. When they want to purchase these rights, what they do is they have to pay us warriors equal to the prices we've set on the services. So let's take a look at the prices we've set. So if the Eyrie player wants to buy one of these bird cards, they're going to have to give me 3. So they'll take 3 Eyrie warriors from their supply and put them into the payments box. Now they can pick and choose one of these cards here to just take, and that'll just go straight into their hand. If they want to buy the riverboats, they'll have to give me another warrior. And if they want to activate the mercenaries, they'll have to give me 2 warriors. All of these things will go into my payments box. Later, these will go down into funds, and I can use them to establish trade posts, or just move them down to commitments in order to do other actions as well. If I don't ever spend them, if I don't spend them to establish trade posts, then these warriors will remain on my board for a very, very long time. When it comes to purchasing services, you can automatically purchase one service at any time. So you could buy a card, or you could buy a riverboat, or you could buy a mercenary. Now you would only ever buy the riverboats or the mercenaries one time, because once you've got it for the turn, then there's no need to buy it again. Services are purchased at the beginning of the purchasing player's birdsong round. So before they do anything else on their turn, they would decide what services they wanted to purchase. You cannot purchase them later on your turn. You must purchase them first. The only one you would ever want to buy more than once is the hand card. You might want to buy more than one card from your hand. But you might also want to buy all 3, which is 3 purchases. So you get 1 purchase no matter what, but every purchase after that requires you to be present in a clearing with a trade post. For example, the Eyrie is present here in this clearing with this trade post, which means that they can make 2 purchases. Their 1 purchase they always get, plus the 2nd purchase for being with the trade post. The trade posts are cumulative, which means that you will always be able to rack up more. Now, in this example here, it looks like people have been making lots of purchases from the Riverfolk company. I want to draw your attention to score dividends. Now, provided there is a trade post on the map, the Riverfolk company will score 1 victory point for every 2 funds. We have 2 funds here in the funds box, therefore we're going to get 1 victory point. However, we're then going to go on to gather funds, wherein all of these things are going to come into the funds area here. Now, if I don't do anything this turn, next turn I'm going to get 4 victory points from scoring dividends, which is a lot of victory points. That's pretty awesome. This incentivizes me to save my money and not spend it, which is great because it really captures the essence of sort of being a mercenary. You'd think it's kind of like not cool, not being able to do anything at all, but it creates this really interesting sort of decision situation where you can still set the prices of your services. So you're still looking at and assessing the board state and trying to figure out what your opponents want to do and what they might want to purchase. And you can always drop a couple into commitments or a couple onto crafting if you don't think you're going to want all the points, or there's something more productive you can do with a couple of extra actions. Now, the problem is that if your opponents see you're doing this and racking up lots of points by saving all of your money, then they could come and destroy your trade posts. When they destroy a trade post, not only does it not return to the board like other buildings, because it's not a building, it's a token, hence why it's round, you will also lose half of your funds rounded up. Wah, wah. If they destroy another trade post, you'll lose another half of your funds. So you have to be careful, because if you save up too much money, your opponents may well come and start destroying your trade posts, or they may boycott you and not buy anything at all. So you might want to make your prices cheaper. Finding a balance between setting the right prices, building trade posts, and scoring dividends is the real art to the Riverfolk company, and it's a really interesting challenge. So last but not least, we've got the Mechanical Marquise. And the Mechanical Marquise is actually really straightforward, which I like a lot. The Mechanical Marquise can be used for solitaire mode, it can be used for cooperative mode, which is 2 to 4, and it can be used as well in lieu of a competitive player in a competitive game. The way the Mechanical Marquise works is very simple, but if you're playing in a cooperative game that is solo or cooperative, then you must remove the dominance cards from this deck. The only way to win is to get 30 victory points before the Mechanical Marquise does. In a competitive game, you can still include the dominance cards if you want, but you can also include the spy cards. I'll explain what they do in a minute. For setup, you take 5 cards from the deck and put them into this card tray like this. These cards are going to represent the Mechanical Marquise programming and hidden moves. So it's important that you don't know what they are. You're also going to take the items that match the symbols down here from the item set on the board and put them into this items for sale box here. This means that if you're playing the Vagabond, you can immediately start trading for some of these items from the Marquis, which is great because there's a sword, there's a sack, there's a teapot in there. All of these are very useful for the Vagabond's board. But what this also means is that these items will not be available for you to craft in order to gain victory points. Remember, in the Mechanical Marquis game, it's all about the first to 30. And if there's less options for crafting from the root deck, then this is going to make it harder for you to get to that 30. I mean, yeah, it's only 4, but still, this is notable. Then just follow the regular setup rules for the Marquise faction, but ignore steps 3 and 4. So that means choose a location for the keep, place the warriors in all of the spaces on the board, but don't put out any buildings because the Mechanical Marquis cares not for buildings. He does not use them. The way the Mechanical Marquis wins is by scoring points for ruling clearings. And so that's what your aim is going to be. It's going to be a race to 30 victory points with you trying to stop her from getting to 30 before you do. And she gets, during her birdsong phase, 2 victory points for every clearing she rules with at least 3 of her warriors in that clearing. Note that she also hates surprises. You cannot use the ambush card against her, which is really devastating. Furthermore, she has poor manual dexterity. Because she doesn't really have a hand of cards, but rather a set of programming instructions, she cannot discard cards, and she cannot give away cards either. So if you would take a card from her hand, instead just draw a card from the deck. If you would have to give her a card, instead she just scores a victory point instead, and you discard a card. So the first thing that happens in the daylight phase is that you reveal the first card in the order. So I revealed here a rabbit card or a bunny card, which means that there's going to be a battle in all of the clearings containing her soldiers that are bunny clearings. And if there are 2 defenders, if I'm playing with a friend in a co-op mode and she could attack either of us, then she first prioritizes the person with the most warriors in the clearing, and then she's going to attack the person with the most victory points. If we're both tied in those things, then she'll prioritize whoever has the highest setup priority. So she'll attack the Eyrie before anyone else, for example. And then she moves, and she moves based on this clearing priority chart here. Now, we've got it here on the autumn side up, and what she does is she'll go into the first priority clearing here, which is number 1, and she'll move everyone in that clearing above 3, and she'll move it to the clearing with the most enemy pieces. So for example, in this situation here, she's only going to move 1 cat because it's just above 3, and she'll move it into this clearing here because there are 2 Woodland Alliance enemies, and there's just 1 here and none here. So you must go through and activate all of the clearings in these orders in order to complete all of the movement. And then once you've done that, a recruitment phase will take place. And in the recruitment phase, we recruit based on the crafting cost of the order card. Recruit 1 to 3 warriors in each clearing that matches the crafting symbol that she rules. So in this case, it's 1 mouse. So we would place 1 to 3 warriors in each clearing of this suit. So in this case, we'd place 1 warrior in each of the mouse clearings that she rules. Note that if there was one of the 3 sets, then she'd get 1 warrior in each clearing she rules. And then if it was the wild card, i.e. the royal claim, then she would get 4 warriors in the keep. If the order card has no crafting cost at all, then we restart the process. So we just discard it and reveal the next card. Note that if it's a bird card, then we just skip the battle and move straight to move because the bird card does not refer to any clearings at all. In the evening, we replenish the schedule up to 5 cards. So if we discarded 2, then we would replace it with 2 new cards. Note that there's a few extra rules here for the cooperative mode. Your objective is to score 30 points before the Marquis does. In the Birdsong phase, if in cooperative mode, in the Birdsong phase, the Marquise scores an additional +1 point per player, so that applies to the per clearing she rules. And in the Daylight phase, the Marquis does not need to rule in order to recruit. You can play a campaign mode as well, where you're trying to get through as many as you can, and for each victory you win, you can keep a permanent crafted card from the last game, and for each victory you have, then in the next game the Marquis starts with 3 more points, so you can try and see how far you get. So I hope that's pretty much taught you everything you need to know about Root. I feel like I covered it pretty in depth, but if you have any questions, please leave a comment below, and I hope you will check out the sections below in the description to find the parts you need. But if you would like to see it in action, I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be playing the Riverfolk expansion with Michael and Ollie, so I really hope that you'll join me for that, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching, everybody.